Good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. Tensions are mounting in Eastern Europe as we await to see what happens between Russia and Ukraine.
President Biden is ramping up the pressure on Vladimir Putin, warning the Russian president of, quote, enormous consequences if he invades Ukraine. The Biden administration says diplomacy is not dead, but war games are taking place along the country's border. The U.S. and allies have vowed to hit Russia with sanctions like never before if Moscow invades. Meanwhile, a Mercer University professor, along with his 12-year-old daughter, are preparing to evacuate from Ukraine.
Political science professor Chris Grant spoke to Ashlyn Webb from Kiev tonight about what it looks like on the ground and their plan to relocate. Ashlyn joins us in studio with more.
Yes, Chris Grant is likely a familiar name to many of you at home. In fact, you've probably seen him here on 13 WMAZ. He's one of our go-to experts for things relating to elections, the Georgia General Assembly, and state laws. For the past 3 weeks, Grant has been in Ukraine doing research as a Fulbright Fellow. But just weeks after arriving in Kyiv, he and his daughter are preparing to evacuate. Since touching down in Ukraine on January 2nd, Mercer University political science professor Chris Grant has documented his time in the country.
So we're out and about this day. We're in the part of Kyiv that's called Podil.
Taking his followers through Kyiv for a trip they expected to last through August.
Certainly a beautiful city and a little cold, a little windy.
But just 3 weeks after unpacking their bags, he and his daughter Olivia are packing back up.
Nobody wants to be in the middle of a hot war. Especially not with my 12-year-old daughter.
The U.S. State Department advises American civilians to leave the country this week. Grant says he feels safe, but
if they tell us to go, I go.
The evacuation is a response to roughly 100,000 Russian troops gathering near Ukraine's border in recent weeks. Grant says that's not far, about an hour and a half away from where he's been staying.
My sense of it is something is going to happen. I don't think you build up 100,000 troops on a border and nothing comes of it.
Grant says on the streets of Kyiv, things seem to be operating like usual, but he says you can feel the tension in the air.
We wound up just coming across a group of people, children, adults, old people, holding up the Ukrainian yellow and blue flag colors. And they were holding them up. There was a long drape that they were holding up in a pretty prominent square in the city. And you see that was pretty spontaneous. Today we were in a metro station and we heard a group of people singing Ukrainian songs of freedom and defense of freedom.
Grant says he's also heard of paramilitary groups preparing for a possible incursion to defend their homes. The political science professor says living through this reminds him of how grateful he is to be an American citizen.
We don't worry about our currency collapsing. We don't worry about an outside power invading our country. We don't worry about these things on a day-to-day basis. My Ukrainian and Georgian and Moldovan friends worry about this from the time they're young kids.
Grant says the State Department and Embassy constantly keep him and other Americans in the country updated. He let me know this evening that he and his daughter plan to evacuate to Warsaw, Poland by Thursday. They expect to be back in central Georgia by the middle of next week. Frank, Lori, back to you.
All right, thank you, Ashlyn. President Biden held classified briefings for House and Senate leadership on the situation with Ukraine and Russia. It comes a day after 8,500 American troops were put on high alert. Tonight, we're taking a closer look at what's happening overseas and how U.S. leadership is preparing for potential conflict. The latest shipment of U.S. military aid arrived in Kiev today. It's part of a $200 million package designed to help bolster the country's defenses. That comes as Russia releases new video of military drills near the border with Europe, raising the concern of a possible invasion.
I made it clear to early on to President Putin that if he were to move into Ukraine, that there'd be severe consequences, including significant economic sanctions.
Top members of the Biden administration's military and diplomatic teams met at the White House a day after thousands of American troops were put on high alert to deploy to NATO countries in Eastern Europe.
Those forces in high alert they're part of a NATO operation, not a sole U.S. operation, and I've made it clear to President Putin that we have a sacred obligation, Article 5 obligation to our NATO ally.
The Defense Department won't rule out the possibility of even more troops being put on high alert. Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said the Biden administration's approach to the situation is encouraging.
We're prepared to take steps before an incursion, not afterwards.
In a trench along the front line in Ukraine, a picture of Russian President Vladimir Putin serves as target practice. Russia, which has 100,000 troops at the border, says it has no plans to invade, but many in Ukraine find that hard to believe. Now, Ukraine's leaders are trying to downplay concerns, saying an invasion from Russia does not appear to be imminent.